Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another session of our AMA. I am your co-host, Mike Almeida, with my business partner, Mark Gibson. We've got a great topic for you today. And to get us started, I want to lead off with a story because I think it's pretty relevant in what we're going to discuss today. And really the idea is talking about the evolution of business through IT. And the story I want to share starts like this. I worked for a company or as an individual contributor, and we sold a widget. I'll just call it that. And part of the business involves renewals after a certain period of time. And so when it came time to go through that renewal, I had a list of information that I exported from a repository because I had a lot of relevant data that I needed for this particular client. And so when I started that renewal process, there were a couple of identifiers that said that this solution that was being renewed would serve this particular function. And when I approached the client about renewing, the client's response is, "Hey, we've already renewed that months ago." I kind of scratched my head and I went back and I looked at my data and I asked the delivery side of the house, "Hey, can you confirm this information for me?" And so the first thought that crossed my mind is, why is this information not accurate? And as I started to go back and forth with this individual, he had to go talk to somebody else to get more information. And then someone sent me a list of literally was a dump of information that I had to go and sift through. And then I asked myself, why is my data so scattered? Why is it all over the place? And it probably took us several hours to finally get the accurate information, realize certain things were labeled incorrectly and things were backwards. And as I took a step back, as my role as an individual contributor in this business, I'm also a business owner. And I asked myself, if it's this hard at an individual contributor level, how hard is it for the business owner to get that roll up? And at the end of the day, the true question I asked myself is, can I trust my data? And why? And if I can't, why can't I trust it? And why can't I use it? So that is a series of questions, Mark, that I wanted to throw at you all at once. Is help me process and digest this.
Yeah, not an uncommon story, right? I mean, the details are not necessarily the same, but a lot of cases, small businesses find themselves in a place where they, data is sort of spread out. It's not really connected. You can't get a complete picture easily. And it's interesting. The theme for a lot of messages these days is making data-driven decisions, right? And knowing, having some experience in that space and knowing some other people who specialize in it. The piece that's the most work is never sort of, visualizing the data. It's all the work on the backside of doing what we're talking about right here, which is how do we bring it together? How do we organize it? How do we sort of synthesize it in a way? Because at the end of the day, what's really true is that you don't make decisions based on data. You typically make the decisions based on information. And not to parse words really there, but typically it's that you look at data as being raw and unfiltered. The information comes from adding some analysis to that, right? And so when you're a small business owner, you find yourselves a lot of times in a place where getting the information is really hard because of the things you're describing. And so the reason that's so common, it's particularly true these days. There's a couple of things, but mostly I'd tell you the two that I think I'd walk you through today. There's one macro reason and there's one micro reason. And the macro reasons largely is, hey, this is just a product of our technical era. If you go back, turn of the century, we'll say roughly, 2000 or so, technology was limiting enough that we had no choice. Everybody worked in the same place,
Right.
For the most part. I mean, there were some exceptions to that, but that was much more enterprise. So I'm talking specifically within small business. Most people didn't have the resources to do anything other than it was hosting it on site. That's where the users were, where the data was, where the applications were. Everything talked to itself, despite the fact that it was somewhat limiting, from a mobility perspective. And out of that sort of developed this, in the industry, this thought process or design called castle and moat, right? That's more about the security of it, but that's, it's a good description of how technology was designed and set up in general. That has changed significantly. And I'm actually going to, share a quick visual here to kind of highlight that a little bit, which is, there's three clouds here. Largely, this is the one that we're talking about, is from the standpoint of where we were around, 2000 or so. Again, like I said, the internet was on an outside boundary of the internal, systems and so forth being there. But then, as technology developed, the infrastructure around it developed, we discovered we could get out of the office. We discovered that first the users could move outside the office, they could use mobile, but then SaaS came around about 10 years ago or so, and we found we could move all the applications out of the office. We can take with it all the data out of the office. And so we look like this piece right here now, which is much more about the idea that we tend to talk about the cloud as it's like this single entity that's sitting, somewhere outside of our office, but it's really not.
Right.
They're all individual clouds based on, systems and applications and design and so forth. So what we do is we put ourselves in a position where all of our data is now separate. It's in multiple clouds. You might have your QuickBooks cloud, you might have your Microsoft cloud, you might have your, Google cloud, you may have your CRM cloud is somewhere else, a HubSpot or something of that nature. Like all of these things live in different places. So along the way, there's been, sort of vendors who've popped up to try to help bridge the connections here. The technology certainly got better to be able to connect it. But if you don't have that, and even when you do have it, it still puts a lot of burden on your users to go to these individual places and get the data. So that's sort of the macro of why we're so scattered. The micro is a little bit more along the lines of the fact that small businesses just don't have data management plans. How do we take that data that we are collecting and grabbing in multiple places, and how do we then blend it together in a way that supports the business? At the end of the day, you as a business are generally selling a product or a service to a customer. There's one connection, right? Like the whole aspect of your business, that's one story, it's one journey. But of your business do different things for those clients. And usually it's around what we talk about often is sort of sell, do, risk, right? There's just this idea of saying, hey, we want to sell our product, we want to deliver our product, and then we want to get paid for our product. The output of that is all of these different records that have a through line, but they have different people sort of servicing them, and different people need different aspects. So there's slightly different agendas in terms of the data they generate, the data they collect, and then of course how they store that data. And so, I'll zoom this in just a bit here. When you even just think about selling, right? You've got these types of activities, sort of marketing campaigns and contact records, your sales activity. That stuff is usually stored in like a CRM. And that's even if you have those systems. You might still be using Google Docs or Excel. You may just work out of your email. The bane of my existence, text. There's almost no good systems really for managing that information. And so, but when you start to do that across the sales function, it then becomes, we start looking at how do I manage and optimize the performance of that function instead, or not necessarily instead of, but separately from how do I manage and optimize your delivery function. Like there's different KPIs that you're looking at. And then finance has another set of information they're looking for. So rather than have a single customer record that serves the needs of each of the departments so that you can then have one picture for the business, we end up with what you experienced, which is I have one set of records for this customer in sales or revenue. I have one set of records for this customer in delivery. And then I have another set of these records for a customer within finance, and none of them are connected.
And
So
I'll add to the point of that, Mark. A lot of the reasons why I had this own repository myself is because there was no place for where that information that I needed was readily available. So I realized, well, some of this information I need, and what I don't have, I'll export it and add that information myself, not realizing that the information, that single
right,
source
right.
of truth, when it was manipulated, there was no feedback loop to let me know that that information changed. So the information has been changing. I'm not aware, and then I wind up in a point where everything is a jumbled mess, and I'm left holding the bag.
Yeah, I mean, it's stressful and painful and clunky, right? As an individual contributor at that level, like, when you're just trying to do the things you need to do for you. But then when you talked about like the idea of a roll up, right, to a business leader who's trying to gauge the performance of their business, it's great if you can get some KPIs for an individual department, but then you've got to sort of mold those into how is my business performing, and again, as we talk about often, it's really about two things you want to try to track for that. One is how well am I generating profit, and then two is how well am I managing any risk to that profit. There's a lot of different indicators, contributors to that. But if they aren't contributing in a cohesive way, you are never going to have the complete picture of the business. So it's kind of like the idea of like, basketball teams or whatever. They talk a lot about, hey, are we 5 individuals or are we one team? Right. And so that's what we end up with in that case is the idea that, everybody's like, hey, I'm doing my part, but who's, got the picture of how does that come out as a business in the total performance? So that's the real challenge for leaders. And so, when we go back to look at, sorry, let me pull that back up real quick. When we go back to look at the cloud pieces of this is really what, we encourage, a lot of our clients. This is the direction we've been taking them. This is what I would encourage most from a design perspective, is the idea that instead of operating in multiple clouds, or try as much as possible to recapture some of those elements of the castle and moat. Now, the thing is, you're moving the castle, right? The castle is no longer your office. The castle becomes what's the central platform where you can collect this data, store it, and be able to massage it at that place. So minimize the number of connections necessarily, but even if you have to have a third-party connection for all of them, that's still better than no connection or a manual connection. And so there's some other layers to this that are outside of data, which is about managing users and identities and devices, things like that. But for the purpose of today's discussion, it's really just how do we consolidate the data so that we can get that complete picture as an owner.
So to that point, that does sound like a good lead-in question, right? I'll take a step back. I think a lot of small business owners, as they get started, they put things in place that are to get the business moving. And then over time,
we just got to make it work.
All these different systems out there.
Yeah.
Once there's a realization that, hey, something's got to change now, what does that look like moving forward? A business owner that says, hey, I realize I got all these islands I'm on. What do I need to do to bring some control to this chaos that I've unconsciously created?
Yeah, that's why I frame it right in those two pieces, that there's a macro and a micro, because there's a part of this that a business owner doesn't necessarily control, or it's really hard to swim upstream against. So the at the business level, at the micro level, the idea of being able to say, hey, do I have a plan? Do I have awareness? Do I understand how this data is even connected? So many times when I have a conversation with a business owner, particularly if we've not worked with them, at any point in the past, when we sit down to start talking about where do your systems are, where's your data live, how does that flow, how do you work, what's the process? I don't know. That the systems have been chosen, implemented, administered only from the perspective of as a user, and nobody has the full picture of what's happening for the organization. So again, there's all these sort of silos and gaps that happen there. So I think the very first thing that I would counsel any business owner to do is that they have to first kind of have a little bit of a discovery or an inventory to understand, hey, where do we keep this stuff? And again, you might not get 100% of everything, but you really got to know what the 3, 4, 5 biggest systems are in your environment, and how do they connect to each other, just start there.
Okay. So thinking about, once we understand, I'll call it those macro pieces, or at least these function of the business that works, you have an understanding. What's the next logical step? Is this something you should do on your own? Are there other folks you need to engage to help shape that?
Well, here's the thing. If you could do it on your own, you probably already did. Right. So there's one aspect of that, and it's not necessarily about, I mean, some of it's about skill set, but it's really, at this level, it's not even about skill set. It's more about bandwidth. You've obviously got a business you're trying to run, as it happens. I mean, I've kind of grown up in this, and I still find it a struggle to, keep up with all of these things as we're going along. So I'd say that there's a clear, part of the reason I mentioned the castle and moat, and the reason I like that design even today, is establishing a clear boundary really between what's internal and external. For quite a while, maybe 5 or 10 years, in us in the IT space, we really were like, well, crap, there is no more boundary. Like, there's no firewall, there's no separation. And that was largely true because of that image that we were looking at, which is all the information lived, somewhere out there in the cloud. And it was hard to really draw a perimeter around it. Those things have changed a bit. I would tell you, like, security wise, the perimeter has really come to focus more on the identity and the data where it lives, versus it being about devices specifically, at the center or whatnot. But even from a functionality perspective, that's still what you're talking about, is do I have access between one system and another for them to be able to exchange and collate that data? That's much easier to do if you've got a clear internal boundary.
Sure.
And again, internal, not in the sense that it's all within my 4 walls, more internal within, these are the platforms that we use and we can influence and go from there. So the other thing that I'll throw out that is surprisingly in 2025, I run across a little more often than I would expect, which is there's still a lot of manual, hard copy data collection and generation. The idea of paper, obviously, or forms that we have, maybe prospects or clients fill out. Sometimes that gets scanned, but in a lot of cases, there really is a good option these days to shift that to a digital process, whether that's using forms or web pages, that kind of thing. That's pretty accessible in the small business space these days. And so as a leader, just kind of shifting your thinking to be default digital rather than manual, so that, because once it's digital, then you've got a lot more options for being able to manipulate and blend the data. So anyway, like I said, it's still a little surprising to me. I keep running into that.
Listen, I'll tell you, in the power utility space, which I have a lot of experience in, you would be surprised that a lot of people still keep manual records from a compliance perspective. But the compliance burden happened like almost 18 years ago, and they still haven't gone to the default digital, which I like that phrase, by the way. That's really good. We got to find some ways to use that elsewhere. But to your point, right, that is just a habit of, hey, it's a requirement. Let me just put something down to take care of it in the moment. And then before you know it, 17 years goes by and it's still there, creating chaos or whatnot. But to piggyback on this conversation, as you start to create these boundaries between this internal, external sharing of information, moving from manual to digital, what are some of the inherent benefits that businesses can see once they start to make that shift into creating this ecosystem that provides valuable insight and data?
Yeah, it's a lot of the same benefits we talk about regularly with, well, in this call in particular, but a lot of the, the visibility piece is tremendous. Talking about, from a decision-making perspective, like doing it blind by gut feel, like that'll get you, to a certain level. Like you're talking about earlier, like the idea of like, hey, I just got to get the business up and running. Like you started the business and there's a direction that you have an instinct and a feel for your industry or your specific niche that will take you, to a certain level. But then as you start to expand the group of people that are, involved in running and serving your client base, that's diluted. Unless you found a way to kind of communicate that. So it's not just visibility for yourself, although that's probably what I would tell you is the primary benefit. It's also visibility for your team so they can kind of understand how everybody else is, progress and status and, updates and records of, hey, what happened 6 months ago, that kind of thing, because there's a lot of, what's generally referred to as institutional knowledge, right? Which is really just what somebody has in their head. So when they leave, so does that data, but unless it was in the system, or even just how much time is spent, on the phone, collaborating with somebody else in your team. You spend an hour to find out what would have taken 10 minutes if somebody had written it down or typed it up, 3 or 4 months ago. Absolutely. That kind of stuff. So there's an efficiency component to this, which obviously always leads to profitability. There's a comfort benefit to this. And then there's also, just the profitability, we talked about it. It's the, ease of life, right? Life gets a little bit easier. I only want to work hard if I really have to. And so if I cannot, leveraging the systems in a more intuitive, natural fashion will help you out with this.
So for listeners, people watching this, how can they evolve their business? What are some steps they can take to go from, I'll call it cloud islands all over the place, castle and moat structure that you've described and you showed an image of?
So this is not something that has a quick fix. Well, let me rephrase that. It could be a quick fix, but it's usually pretty expensive and disruptive to do that.
That's right.
And so, it's one of those things. It didn't really develop over a couple of weeks. You probably won't fix it in a couple of weeks. But once you sit down and you really settle on even just the basics of a data management plan, what are the key things that you need to have roll up? What are the key things you need visibility to? Understanding where those systems are and how that data is collected or generated, and then how it's stored, and then how do we bring it together? So once you got the basics of that, that can help you to, make, as you get organic opportunities to, change technology or change processes, you can, shape those against this criteria of, as we've talked about in other places. And, for me, like when I talk about technology, it's not really ever best feature. It's more about best fit. This is kind of what we're talking about, is the idea of how do we get that technology to fit into all the other puzzle pieces. But if that becomes your guiding principle, your North Star, this is something that might take you a couple of years to, sort of complete, but you can still see meaningful impact, 6-9 months, but you just have to have a North Star to work against. So that's really what I would tell you is the first kind of step of this, and then take those ancillary, secondary steps as they become available to you.
Excellent. No, it's really good feedback. So, okay, let's go to some questions here. These are going to be a doozy. So, first question: why do you think an organization's data lives in so many disconnected silos, and what cultural or procedural habits keep those silos from being merged?
Well, there's the two things we talked about, right? I mean, I think the first answer is the macro, which is really the foundational piece, which is just that's how the technology is developed. And it's really just been in the last couple of years, I think, that there's been a meaningful, practical alternative to that. Culturally, by human nature, right, is we all are a little bit fragmented. We're all a little bit segmented. It takes leadership to really bring us together to contribute to one mission. And so, without getting too much outside of the technology side of this, I'd say it's about that. It's what's the vision? What's the plan? What's the direction we're heading? I think there's there's a saying that came out of a book about NASA or whatnot. It was responsible for the job, accountable to the mission, something that of those lines. What is the mission? And how do you contribute to that as an organization? So again, that's off the page from a technology perspective, but it's probably the more critical aspect of this.
Okay, fair enough. That's a good answer. Okay, so here's an interesting question. This one's pretty detailed. So we've talked about BPS, and you showed this diagram: sales, delivery, and risk, and how they all operate in fluidly. So when you think about those three teams, how do they define success for a customer, and where do those definitions diverge in the data that they're collecting?
All right. I'm not sure how clear that question is for me. I think what we're asking is measuring the results of the individual department maybe versus the business.
I would take how they measure success, and then where does that delineation point go when it comes to the data that they collect?
Yeah, it's things I think like when we talk about like, hey, take cost per lead as an example, right? Like if we're generating great revenue, we might have big wins if we're looking at just from a sales perspective, but not all revenue is good revenue, right? And so you might sell a deal, maybe it's $100,000, but the margin on it's terrible. Yeah, that's a great sales thing. It might look great in the revenue generation KPIs, but then, you sold it at 25% margin. And so you can't even really deliver on it and still make a profit. Those two departments are looking at that very differently. Same deal, but it's because there wasn't a common number to kind of look at that. Again, this is where we get back to profit generation is usually the number one thing that that you're looking at from your business perspective. And so if you've, got a clear view of how that one deal would impact your profit, that deal probably wouldn't have been approved, or the guidelines would be available to the salesperson to know that that's not the deal they can make, So that's the other one piece that usually comes up a lot is, hey, we sold that deal. It's at the right margins, but then we don't get paid on time. So, this is where we talk about profits on paper, cash is in the bank, right? And so that's why finance falls into that risk category, which is the idea of, yeah, sure, it was a great deal, but we're still waiting, for 3 months to get paid, whatever.
So I think this next question really piggybacks off of this one in a good way. What would a single source of truth repository mean for a leadership team's ability to forecast revenue and allocate resources accordingly?
Well, I think in terms of what it would mean, it would just give them clarity. Nobody can predict the future, but the best indicator is past performance. And if you don't have that clear idea of what the past performance is, it's really, really difficult to be able to. You're basically just throwing darts at the wall, at that point. And the other part of that is, there's accuracy of the data, but there's also the timeliness of the data, and that's usually when most people get. That means kind of the point of BPS as a whole is accounting data. You can get that, on a monthly basis, usually a few weeks after the fact. I can't use that to, predict what's happening in this month. It's already gone. It's usually a couple months into your year before you get the accounting. So it's highly accurate, but it's delayed. As a business owner or a leader making operational decisions, you just need good general information. Timely is maybe a little bit more important than accurate. So that's what I think we'd be looking at here as the main benefit of what's happening.
Awesome. All right. I think we got time for one more question. This should be a good summary wrap up one. So when you look ahead, this design, you talk about this castle moat. How would you measure the success of a data unification initiative, like a castle moat structure? And what leading indicators will tell you the organization is finally making decisions on trusted information?
That's going to look pretty different from one group to the next. But the first thing I would say I think from a quality of data perspective, that's really how you would measure the success. Meaning, how many systems do we have contributing to the information that's being used by the leadership team, that's being reviewed, these reports? Again, are they timely? So I think, success, if I were just, starting right now to a project, I would say, hey, we need to be able to identify these 4 or 5 reports that cover these 4 or 5 key critical components, and we need to have them within 1 week of month's end, as an example. That's a sample project that I would put together and say, if we can deliver that, now we have success. Now, what it takes to get there and the indicators in between has a lot to do with how many systems are already outside these boundaries. How many of the systems are connected? That's a little bit more of that discovery activity that we were talking about. Because if you have this information scattered across 10, 12 systems that all are outside your boundary, you got a lot of work ahead of you. But most often what we find is that even when there's 10 to 12, there really should only be 4 or 5, because there's just, a lot of unused capacity. There's just a lot of overlap between, systems that do the same thing, that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the indicators, is how many systems are outside of the system and how well do they talk. You can get a pretty good handle on that. And then once that's in place, that'll lead to being able to get those reports in the time frame that you've identified.
Well said. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So Mark, thanks again for an exciting topic. Very intriguing. Hopefully everyone learned a lot. I know that I certainly did, and I feel better about that situation I told you about earlier today. So for all of our audience out there, if you guys like this content and you want to continue to follow us, please do. You can subscribe and like to us on LinkedIn, or you can follow us on LinkedIn Live the last Friday of the month. So with that being said, Mark, thanks for your time today, and I'll catch you on the other